In the heart of Europe, a region that for decades was a symbol of forced coexistence was peering into the abyss. The Balkans, a mosaic of cultures, religions, and ancestral memories, contained the embers of old grudges that the winds of history were about to rekindle. This is not just the tale of a war, but the chronicle of a collapse, the dissection of how neighbors became enemies and how a whisper of discontent transformed into a battle cry that would tear apart families, cities, and the very soul of a nation. We delve into the epicenter of the Powder Keg just before the detonation. For nearly 40 years, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia seemed a geopolitical miracle. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, Montenegrins, and Macedonians coexisted under one flag. However, this unity was an illusion sustained by the will of a single man, Marshal Josip Broz Tito. His authoritarian leadership, a blend of charisma, Yugoslav nationalism, and selective repression, acted as the dam that contained an ocean of ethnic tensions. With his death in 1980, the first cracks appeared in the wall. The giant had feet of clay, and the power vacuum he left became fertile ground for the demons of the past to walk the earth once more. The 1980s brought with them an economic crisis that poisoned the system. Galloping inflation, unemployment, and systemic corruption eroded faith in the Yugoslav project. It was in this void that figures emerged who saw chaos as an opportunity. Local politicians, desperate to maintain their relevance, found in nationalism the perfect fuel to mobilize the masses. Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia rose as the prophet of a new era of Serbian pride with rhetoric that promised redemption and power. Was it an act of salvation for his people, or the most cynical of manipulations to cling to power at any cost? The tragedy of the Balkans was written through the decisions of men like Milosevic, but he was not alone. In Croatia, Franjo Tudman dreamed of an independent Croatian nation, while in Bosnia, Alija Izetbegovic navigated the turbulent waters of a multi-ethnic republic on the brink of fracture. The collision of these ambitions, each wrapped in the banner of self-determination, would not only define the future of their peoples but ignite the fuse of a conflict that would spread like wildfire. The point of no return came in 1991. The declarations of independence from Slovenia and Croatia were the catalyst. For many Serbs, it was an unacceptable betrayal, an existential threat that justified a military response. In June, tanks rolled into Slovenia. The 10-day war, although brief, was the first funeral bell, a terrifying omen of the brutality that was about to be unleashed. The world watched, incredulous, failing to understand that this was not a mere border dispute, but the first act of a tragedy of continental scale. The immediate aftermath of these initial acts was of incalculable devastation. The violence in Slovenia was merely the prelude to the much bloodier wars that would erupt in Croatia and, subsequently, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, plunging the region into a cycle of ethnic cleansing, sieges, and human suffering. The international community, paralyzed by indecision, would take too long to grasp the magnitude of the horror. The enigma posed by the beginning of the Balkan Wars is as profound as it is disturbing. How could a society that shared streets, schools, and lives for generations disintegrate into a bloodbath with such dizzying speed? What ancestral hatreds and what modern ambitions conspired to unleash hell? This chapter is merely the first piece of a macabre puzzle that will force us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. As we close this introduction, the question resonates powerfully. Was this fate written in the history of the Balkans, or was it forged by the hands of a few powerful men? In the next chapter, we will analyze the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Seeking the tectonic faults that triggered the earthquake, the search for answers has only just begun. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The shockwave of that crisis would soon transform into a cataclysm that would shake the foundations of a nation. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, a complex mosaic of ethnicities and cultures. stood on the brink of the abyss in the decade of the 1980s. The shadow of discontent loomed over its citizens as ethnic and political tensions intensified in an environment of rising nationalism. The death of Josip Broz Tito in 1980 marked the beginning of an era of uncertainty and division, leaving a leadership vacuum that would soon become an enigma defining the course of regional history. In a context where economies were in crisis and signs of disintegration were increasingly evident, the constituent republics of Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro and Macedonia began to question their place within the federation. The Yugoslav economy, which had relied on a delicate balance of subsidies and centralized policies, was crumbling. Inflation soared and external debt accumulated like an ominous shadow. How could Yugoslavia, a nation that had achieved peace in the post-war period, arrive at such a precarious state? Emerging leaders such as Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and Franjo Tudman in Croatia would play crucial roles in this drama. Milosevic, a politician who knew how to connect with popular discontent, positioned himself as the defender of the Serbs, promising to restore national pride. His famous phrase, "No one has the right to hit you," spoken to Serbs in Kosovo, resonated in a country where fear and suspicion were beginning to take shape. Tudman, for his part, yearned for Croatian independence and the restoration of a sovereign state, adding fuel to the fire of nationalism. Both men, in their quest for power, dismissed warnings about the danger of exacerbating ethnic divisions on their path to self-sufficiency. Against the backdrop of growing tension, the year 1991 became a turning point. The republics of Slovenia and Croatia, driven by the need for self-determination and fueled by nationalist fervour, decided to declare their independence. But what would be the cost of this freedom? In Slovenia, the declaration of independence was followed by a brief conflict known as the 10-Day War, where Yugoslav forces attempted to suppress the uprising. Slovenian resistance was organized and effective, and the international community watched with growing concern, wondering if this would be the beginning of a new era of violence in the Balkans. Meanwhile, in Croatia, the situation became more complex. The Serbian population in Croatia, which had lived in the country for generations, faced the prospect of a state they perceived as hostile. In this context, Milosevic's decision to support Serbian communities in Croatia became a catalyst for conflict. The shadow of Serbian nationalism loomed, and ethnic tensions transformed into open hostilities. How could the hopes for peaceful coexistence succumb to the vortex of hatred? As the conflict intensified, the decisions of political and military leaders became increasingly drastic. The intervention of the Yugoslav People's Army, in an attempt to maintain the unity of the federation, became a symbol of the resistance of a state that was already crumbling. Croatian cities were besieged, and the echo of gunfire resonated in the streets that had once been a symbol of coexistence. In this scenario, the lives of thousands of citizens became mere figures within an increasingly brutal conflict. The direct repercussions of these events were catastrophic. The war not only led to the loss of lives, but also sowed the seeds of hatred that would endure for generations. Refugees began to flee, leaving behind their homes while communities fragmented. The international community, slow to react, faced a moral dilemma: how to intervene in a conflict that seemed to have no solution. The enigma of the collapse of Yugoslavia is deep and complex. What lessons can be drawn from the fragmentation of a nation that had been presented as a model of coexistence? The decisions of its leaders, driven by the pursuit of power and the manipulation of identities, led to a tragedy that changed the geopolitics of the region forever. In that labyrinth of decisions, betrayals, and ambitions, the responsibility for the disintegration of the state dissolves into a complex web of factors. As the echo of bullets faded in some areas, the future of the Balkans became uncertain. The quest for independence and the affirmation of national identities had created a new map, but also a deep wound that would take years to heal. Against this backdrop, attention turned to the next steps that Slovenia and Croatia would take on their path to independence. history was far from over, and the flames of war were still about to ignite in other parts of the region. In this context, the declaration of independence of Slovenia and Croatia emerged as a decisive act in a power struggle that would change the fate of millions. The latent crisis would soon manifest itself in a tangible way. In 1991, the yearning for self-determination that had been resonating for years in the heart of Slovenia and Croatia turned into a cry for independence. Once again revealing the fractures that ran through the former Yugoslavia, this chapter delves into the process of declaring independence for Slovenia and Croatia at a moment that would change the course of Balkan history. The backdrop of this period is complex and turbulent. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which had kept a diversity of peoples and cultures united under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, began to crumble after the death of its leader in 1980. Economic instability, rising ethnic tensions, and the erosion of central authority created an environment in which the voices of nationalism and autonomy began to gain strength. The elections at the end of the 1980s in Slovenia and Croatia brought to power leaders advocating for independence, such as Milan Kukan and Franjo Tudman, who, amid a context of growing discontent, would become protagonists of a historical transformation. Slovenia's decision to declare its independence on the 25th of June in 1991 was an act laden with symbolism and challenge. Driven by a referendum that certified overwhelming popular support, Slovenia dared to take a decisive step toward autonomy. However, this act was not simply a desire for separation, but was framed within a context of deep crisis. The perception that the central administration served more the interests of Serbia than those of the other republics, along with the repression of Slovenian aspirations by Belgrade, fueled this sense of urgency. At the same time, Croatia, which had undergone a similar process in its quest for independence, would follow a parallel path. With a predominantly Croatian population, nationalist sentiment intensified as Franjo Tudman, a controversial figure with a military background, began to consolidate his power. On the 25th of June, the same day Slovenia proclaimed its independence, Croatia did the same, challenging a Yugoslav government that was beginning to show signs of disintegration. But what forces were at play behind these bold decisions? The leaders of these movements, while sharing the desire for independence, had different visions for the future of their nations. Milan Kukan, a pragmatic politician, advocated for a moderate approach, seeking to avoid violent escalation, while Franjo Tudman, with his military background, seemed to steer Croatia toward confrontation. This contrast in approaches would be a crucial factor in the escalation of tensions in the region. On the 26th of June in 1991, following the declarations of independence, the Yugoslav government, influenced by Slobodan Milosevic, responded with force. The situation became critical in Slovenia, where Yugoslav troops began to mobilize, initiating a brief but intense conflict known as the 10-Day War. The international community, attentive yet indecisive, watched from a distance, wondering how far these independence movements would go and what consequences they would bring. In Croatia, the reactions were swift. The declaration of independence was followed by an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The Serbian minorities in Croatia, fearful of losing their status, began to organize, leading to tensions that would escalate into armed conflicts. The shadow of war loomed over a nation that, after proclaiming its desire for freedom, found itself on the brink of a humanitarian crisis. The immediate consequences of these events were profound and far-reaching. Slovenia, after a brief confrontation, managed to consolidate its independence, but at a high cost in terms of human lives and resources. Croatia, on the other hand, plunged into a prolonged war that would not only deplete its resources but also leave indelible scars on its population. The Declaration of Independence had unleashed forces that, once freed, would be difficult to control. The enigma that persists after these events is how, in a context of yearning for self-determination, the pursuit of freedom transformed into a path toward war. What was the true cost of these decisions, and what legacy did they leave in the collective memory of these peoples? The answers to these questions, even today, remain subjects of debate and reflection. The shadow of those tumultuous days reminds us that the struggle for independence is not always a path toward peace. The decisions made in those crucial moments not only defined the future of Slovenia and Croatia, but also set the stage for the conflicts to come, such as the 10-Day War, which we will explore in the next chapter. The Declaration of Independence of Slovenia in June 1991 was not simply a symbolic act. It was the spark that ignited a powder keg in a region already marked by ethnic and political tensions. This declaration manifested itself in an armed conflict, a brief but intense confrontation known as the 10-Day War. In this context, the young Slovenian Republic found itself not only fighting for its autonomy, but also facing the shadows of a Yugoslav legacy that still resonated in the collective memory of its inhabitants. In the background of this declaration lay a tumultuous political environment. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 had unleashed a wave of independence movements in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. In Yugoslavia, the figure of Slobodan Milosevic, who rose to power in Serbia, fueled a Serbian nationalism that threatened to destabilize the fragile unity of the country. Resistance to Serbian centralism grew, especially in Slovenia and Croatia, where aspirations for independence began to take shape. The decision of the People's Assembly of Slovenia to proclaim independence was supported by a referendum in which more than 90% of voters expressed their desire for separation. However, the echo of this decision would resonate far beyond the borders of Slovenia. At the center of this maelstrom were key figures who, with their decisions, would shape the fate of the region. Milan Kukan, the Slovenian president, became a symbol of the struggle for independence. His leadership and vision of a free Slovenia were fundamental in mobilizing popular support. On the opposite side, the general of the Yugoslav People's Army, Veljko Kadijević, ordered his troops to intervene to suppress what he considered a rebellion against Yugoslav unity. Kadijevic's decision to employ military force to crush the Slovenian independence movement would mark the beginning of a brief but violent conflict. On the 27th of June 1991, Slovenia officially declared its independence. In response, the Yugoslav People's Army launched a military offensive in an attempt to regain control. However, what was expected to be a swift repression quickly turned into an unexpected confrontation. The Slovenian forces, with a significantly smaller number of soldiers and resources, demonstrated surprising resilience. Utilizing guerrilla tactics and leveraging their knowledge of the terrain, the Slovenians managed to inflict significant defeats on the Yugoslav forces. The conflict centered on several strategic points, such as border crossings and military barracks, where the Slovenians showcased an organizational capacity that surprised their adversaries. Amidst this chaos, the international community watched closely. The European Union, which was still in the process of consolidation, was pressured to act. The intervention of European mediators sought to stop the bloodshed and restore peace. However, ceasefire talks were marred by mutual distrust and the ongoing escalation of violence. As the days progressed, Slovenian cities became the scenes of a conflict that, despite its brevity, left a deep mark on the collective memory of the nation. The conflict culminated on the 7th of July 1991, when a ceasefire agreement was signed that ended hostilities after 10 days of intense fighting. Slovenia had managed to consolidate its independence, but at a significant human and material cost. It is estimated that at least 60 people lost their lives during the war, and thousands more were injured. The aftermath of this brief confrontation left a trail of pain and division, and the question that lingered in the air was, had the struggle for Slovenian identity and autonomy truly ended? Or was it merely the beginning of a broader conflict in the region? The enigma of this chapter lies in the paradox of a war so short, yet so significant. How can a conflict lasting 10 days change the course of a nation's history? What secrets of the past and present lie hidden behind Slovenia's declaration of independence? The answer to these questions can be found in the unfolding events that would follow, where the outbreak of war in Croatia would mark the beginning of a cycle of violence that would resonate throughout the region. As Slovenia emerged from the shadows of war, the echo of the struggle for independence extended southward. The Croatian War, which would erupt in the following months, promised to be an even more complex and devastating chapter in the history of the Balkans. The fragility of the peace achieved in Slovenia would be threatened by a new conflict, where the ghosts of the past would return to haunt the peoples of the region. The crisis would soon expand beyond the borders of Slovenia. With the fragility of the balance in the Balkan region, the echo of independence would resonate in Croatia, a territory yearning to free itself from the Yugoslav Federation. In this context of latent tensions, history was preparing to write a new chapter, one that would unleash an armed conflict that would sear the collective memory of its inhabitants. The year 1991 not only marked the birth of new nations, but also the emergence of old grievances and resentments. In Croatia, the situation was especially volatile. The population, largely composed of an ethnic Croatian majority, found itself at a crossroads. The leadership of then-President Franjo Tudman, a former general of the army who had been imprisoned for his nationalist views, fueled independence aspirations. In contrast, the Serbian minority in Croatia, which occupied vital territories in the north and east of the country, feared for its future in an independent Croatia. On the 25th of June 1991, Croatia proclaimed its independence. However, instead of uniting in celebration, the announcement was met with disdain and hostility from the government in Belgrade. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, who had been orchestrating a shift towards a more aggressive Serbian nationalism, was unwilling to allow a Croatian state to prosper at the expense of Serbian interests. Thus, the Yugoslav People's Army, which had once been a bastion of unified power, aligned itself with Serbian forces seeking to maintain control over those regions where the Serbian population predominated. As tensions escalated, the Yugoslav People's Army began to mobilize, justifying its actions with a discourse proclaiming the need to protect the Serbian population in Croatia. The first spark of war ignited on the 17th of August 1991 when the Yugoslav People's Army launched a series of attacks on the Croatian cities of Vukovar and Osijek. Images of burning buildings and the despair of civilians began to populate news broadcasts around the world, but they also revealed a darker side of the conflict, the brutality and devastation that would be unleashed. Croatian leaders, in their attempt to forge a new state, faced a harsh reality. Armed resistance began to organize into militias composed of Croatian volunteers who confronted the Yugoslav People's Army. However, this resistance was not without controversy. The figure of Tudman, who had promised to unite his people, began to be questioned by some sectors. Were his ambitions guided by the desire for a united Croatia or by a nationalism that could lead to further divisions? The development of events was as swift as it was chaotic. In November 1991, Vukovar became the symbol of Croatian resistance. For months, the city was subjected to a brutal siege by the Yugoslav People's Army. The civilian population suffered under unimaginable conditions, becoming a microcosm of the horrors of war. The fall of Vukovar in November marked a strategic victory for the Yugoslav People's Army, but at a devastating moral cost. In the echo of battles lost and won, the voices of those who had become victims of their own history resonated. The consequences of this conflict proved to be profound and lasting. The war in Croatia not only resulted in thousands of dead and wounded, but also left a legacy of distrust and resentment among ethnic communities. The intervention of the Yugoslav People's Army had transformed what began as a movement for independence into a brutal armed conflict, where the lines of ethnic demarcation became increasingly blurred and bloody. The atrocities committed by both sides not only stained Croatian soil, but also sowed the seeds of an uncertain future. As the war intensified, the question that hung in the air was, could Croatia find peace amid the chaos? Or was the path to independence destined to be marked by tragedy and suffering? The enigma surrounding the war in Croatia focused not only on battles for territory but also on struggles for identity, memory, and human rights. Thus, with the conflict in full boil, attention turned to the next chapter of this harrowing saga. The crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina loomed on the horizon, bringing with it a new set of challenges and dilemmas that threatened to further overflow the fragile peace in the Balkans. How would the forces of history be unleashed in this new scenario? The shadow of the past loomed over the future, and the echo of wars would still resonate in the collective consciousness of the region. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. Instability would spread like an ominous shadow over the region. In the early 1990s, the echo of the struggle for independence resonated in the hearts of the peoples who had lived under the yoke of a disintegrating Yugoslavia. In this tumultuous context, Bosnia and Herzegovina, a republic marked by an ethnic mosaic, began to chart its own destiny. The Declaration of Independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina on the 1st of March 1992 would be the trigger for a conflict that would reveal the complexities of a divided country and the atrocities that could arise when ethnic tension turned into open violence. The political and social environment that preceded this moment was a breeding ground for conflict. The disintegration of Yugoslavia, which had accelerated with the independence of Slovenia and Croatia, left Bosnia and Herzegovina in a precarious situation. The population, composed of a mix of Bosniak Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats, lived under a fragile coexistence. The ethnic tensions that had been suppressed for decades began to surface, revealing the deep resentment that existed among the different communities. Political instability, exacerbated by the fall of the communist regime, provided fertile ground for the emergence of nationalist leaders who sought to exploit popular discontent. The main actor in this drama was Alija Izetbegović, leader of the Party of Democratic Action and future president of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Izetbegović advocated for independence and promoted a vision of Bosnia as a multi-ethnic state. However, his ambitions would face the harsh reality of a country divided by ethnic loyalties. The Declaration of Independence was supported by a referendum in which the majority of the population voted in favor of separating from Yugoslavia. But the Bosnian Serbs boycotted the vote, which already foreshadowed an imminent conflict. Radovan Karadzic, a Serbian nationalist leader, was one of the main opponents of independence and spared no effort to ensure that Bosnia remained under Serbian control. As the date of the declaration approached, tensions reached a critical point. In April 1992, shortly after Bosnia and Herzegovina proclaimed its independence, Serbian forces began to take strategic positions, signaling the start of an armed conflict. In a chilling turn of events, the civil war erupted, unleashing a violence that was anticipated but that no one wanted to witness. Communities that once lived together transformed into fierce enemies, and the echoes of war resonated in every corner of the republic. Cities and towns were devastated, borders became lines of blood. The unfolding of events was chaotic and brutal. Serbian forces, supported by the Yugoslav People's Army, carried out a strategy of territorial conquest that resulted in a systematic siege of cities and a series of massacres. Sarajevo, the capital, became a symbol of human suffering. Meanwhile, Croatian forces also began to intervene, further entangling the war landscape. The complexity of the conflict intensified with each passing day, and loyalties became increasingly blurred. How had Bosnia come to this point? What secrets lay behind a declaration that promised freedom but quickly turned into a harbinger of horror? The immediate consequences of these events were devastating. The civilian population became the target of violence, and thousands of people were displaced, killed, or went missing. The international community watched in shock as the genocide unfolded in Europe, and the echo of their cries for help resonated in the halls of the United Nations, where the response was slow and hesitant. Bosnia and Herzegovina transformed into a battlefield where ethnic identity became the justification for barbarity. The wounds opened by the war would leave deep scars, not only on the territory but also in the collective memory of its people. The enigma surrounding this crisis is profound. What led a people with a long legacy of coexistence to plunge into violence? Was it the ambition of nationalist leaders, the manipulation of fear, or a legacy of historical resentments? The answers, though elusive, are fundamental to understanding the conflict in its entirety. The story of the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina is not just a narrative of events, it is a labyrinth of emotions, decisions and consequences that still resonate in the present, against the backdrop of war and suffering. The next chapter will take us to one of the darkest episodes of the conflict, the Siege of Sarajevo. There, the struggle for control of the city would become even bloodier, and the lessons of independence would confront the harsh reality of the siege. The history of Bosnia and Herzegovina is far from over, and as shadows loom over its future, the search for answers continues. The Bosnian crisis would soon transform into the most heartbreaking episode in the recent history of the region. As ethnic and political tensions intensified, Sarajevo, the capital, became the stage for a siege that would leave an indelible mark on the collective memory. The Siege of Sarajevo, which began in April 1992 and extended until February 1996, was not just a military conflict, it was a struggle for survival, for identity, and ultimately, for the soul of a torn nation. The historical context that preceded this siege is fundamental to understanding the gravity of the events. Sarajevo had been for centuries a meeting point of diverse cultures and religions, a microcosm of Balkan diversity. However, the disintegration of Yugoslavia, which began in the early 1990s, unleashed centrifugal forces that fragmented this delicate balance. The independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina, declared in March 1992, was met with hostility from Serbian nationalists who viewed Sarajevo, with its predominantly Muslim and Croatian population, as a stronghold they needed to conquer. The shadow of nationalism loomed over the city, while the echoes of war resonated in the hearts of its inhabitants. Among the key actors in this historical tragedy was Serbian leader Radovan Karadzic, who, driven by fervent nationalism, made decisions that would change the course of the conflict. Alongside him, General Ratko Mladic, known for his brutality and military strategy, became the commander of Serbian forces in Bosnia. Meanwhile, Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović sought international legitimacy and support from Western powers. In this complex web of interests, the decisions of these men were crucial, but so were those who found themselves in the rear. In the streets of Sarajevo, where civilians unwittingly became protagonists of a story they had not chosen. The unfolding of events took place against a backdrop of growing tension. On the 5th of April 1992, protests erupted in Sarajevo. Distrust took hold of neighborhoods, and the first skirmishes quickly escalated into a large-scale siege. Serbian forces with their heavy artillery began to bombard the city, while snipers took positions on the surrounding hills. Sarajevo, a vibrant city, transformed into a labyrinth of ruins and despair. Daily life faded away and fear settled into every corner. The once bustling markets became meeting places for those seeking refuge amid the storm. The international community, although aware of the suffering looming over Sarajevo, was reluctant to intervene decisively. Why did the world look the other way? The answer to this question becomes a grim echo in the context of the siege, where thousands of men, women, and children experienced the terror of hunger and violence. Reports from the United Nations and the heartbreaking images reaching the media failed to translate into concrete actions. The siege dragged on, and with it, devastation. The immediate consequences of the Siege of Sarajevo were catastrophic. More than 11,000 people lost their lives and thousands more were injured. Living conditions deteriorated alarmingly. The supply of water, electricity, and food became scarce, and desperation consumed the population. The international community, which had witnessed the suffering of Sarajevo, was finally compelled to react, albeit late. The arrival of United Nations peacekeeping forces in an attempt to end the siege marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict, but the shadow of war continued to loom. The enigma of the chapter reveals itself in a troubling question: could the Siege of Sarajevo have been avoided? The decisions of leaders, the interests of international powers, and the resilience of the Bosnian people intertwine a complex narrative that resists being unraveled. The suffering of Sarajevo was not just an echo in history. It was a heart-wrenching cry that still resonates in the hearts of those who lived through those dark days. The story of the Siege of Sarajevo is, therefore, a reminder of the atrocities that can arise from intolerance and unchecked nationalism. As we delve into the next chapter, we will confront the chilling reality of the ethnic cleansing that took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What secrets still awaited in the depths of this conflict? How did the suffering of Sarajevo translate into a cycle of violence that obliterated the hope for peace in the region? The answers lie waiting in the shadows of history. The war crisis would soon transform into a dark chapter in the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina. As ethnic tensions intensified, rival factions began to implement systematic campaigns of ethnic cleansing, a term that would resonate with horror in the echoes of the 20th century. The disintegration of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia had left a power vacuum and a fervent desire for territorial and ethnic control. In this context, the concept of ethnic cleansing emerged as a brutal response to the cultural diversity of the country, carrying out a series of atrocities that would indelibly mark the nation. The political and social atmosphere in Bosnia in the early 1990s was permeated with fear and distrust. Following the declaration of independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992, tensions between Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats reached a critical point. The speeches of political leaders of the time, such as Radovan Karadzic, president of the self-proclaimed Republika Srpska, and Franjo Tudman, president of Croatia, fueled a climate of hostility. Messages were articulated that claimed ethnic supremacy, thus justifying violence and persecution. It was a time when identity became a weapon, and communities that once coexisted peacefully turned into enemies. The definition of ethnic cleansing, although not official at first, solidified during this period as a methodical and deliberate process to eliminate an ethnic group from a geographical area. The decisions made by the leaders of armed factions driven by extreme nationalist ideologies led to the implementation of practices that included murders, forced displacements, and systematic rapes. The figure of Ratko Mladic, commander of the army of Republika Srpska, became synonymous with this terrifying strategy. His actions and orders reveal not only the barbarity of the acts, but also the distorted logic that guided those willing to carry out such atrocities. The most notorious events of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia occurred between 1992 and 1995, when Serbian forces backed by Republika Srpska launched a series of operations in various regions of the country. One of the first and most shocking was the campaign in the Prijedor region, where concentration camps were established, such as the infamous Omarska. In these places, thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Croats were detained, tortured, and killed. The images that emerged from these camps, captured by the international press, shocked the world and revealed the horror that was unfolding in the heart of Europe. The development of these events was marked by brutality and dehumanization. In an effort to purify the region, Serbian forces implemented a process of forced displacement that resulted in the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of people from their homes. The city of Srebrenica, which had been declared a safe haven by the United Nations, became the scene of one of the most infamous massacres of the war. In July of 1995, more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed in an act that was classified as genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This event, along with others, left an open wound in the collective memory of Bosnia that still persists. The immediate consequences of these ethnic cleansing campaigns were devastating. Communities disintegrated, and the social fabric that once united Bosnians was torn irreparably. Entire families were separated, and fear became the new normal. In the international arena, the inaction of the global community was equally shocking. Despite evidence of war crimes and human rights violations, responses were slow and often ineffective. The lack of timely intervention left thousands of people at the mercy of violence and barbarity. However, the enigma that lingers in historical memory is, how was it possible that, in the heart of Europe, such atrocities were allowed to occur? What systemic failures in the international community led to inaction in the face of such evident suffering? The shadow of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia raises profound questions about the role of humanity in protecting the fundamental rights of its fellow beings. It is a chilling reminder that the echoes of the past can resonate in the present, and that history, with its unlearned lessons, can repeat itself. As this dark chapter of Balkan history unfolds, attention turns to the international response that emerged amid the devastation. Could the global community have done more to stop this wave of violence? In the next chapter, we will explore the initial reactions and actions of the international community in response to the wars in the Balkans, a quest to understand the role the world played in one of the most tragic conflicts of our era. The crisis in the Balkans would soon capture the attention of international powers, who found themselves astonished by the disintegration of one of the most emblematic nations of the 20th century. The Balkan Wars would not only mark a dark chapter in the history of Europe, but also unleash a whirlwind of reactions that would test the will and morality of the international community. The echo of violence in the region would resonate in the halls of governments and international organizations, forcing them to confront a dilemma that had become a political enigma: how to intervene without further exacerbating the conflict. By the late 1990s, the global political landscape was dominated by the end of the Cold War and the emergence of new power dynamics. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 had opened a series of opportunities and tensions in Eastern Europe, and Western powers, led by the United States, were eager to establish a new order. However, the outbreak of wars in the Balkans revealed the fragility of this new system and the challenge posed by intervention in conflicts where ethnic identities were deeply rooted and historical wounds still bled. In this context, world leaders faced critical decisions. The American President Bill Clinton, the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the French President François Mitterrand were just some of the actors at the crossroads of international politics. Meanwhile, at the United Nations headquarters, Secretary-General Boutros Ghali struggled to find a coherent and effective response to the chaos unfolding in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Could Western powers truly act as mediators in such an intricate conflict, where history and collective memory played a fundamental role? The development of events in the Balkans was dizzying. In 1991, following the declaration of independence of Slovenia and Croatia, violence escalated rapidly. The international community, initially passive, began to observe with growing concern the brutality of the conflict. In 1992, after the outbreak of war in Bosnia, images of devastation, mass displacement, and ethnic cleansing began to appear on news broadcasts around the world, shocking public opinion. The Srebrenica massacre in 1995 became a symbol of the international failure to prevent genocide, leaving an indelible stain on the collective conscience. In response to these crises, the United Nations took actions that, although well-intentioned, were destined to face serious limitations. Peacekeeping missions were established, but these forces were often deprived of the necessary resources and mandate to address the magnitude of the conflict. Images of United Nations soldiers in Sarajevo, powerless in the face of a siege that would last nearly 4 years, raised a troubling question: was peace an achievable ideal amid war and hatred? The decisions of international actors became increasingly complex. While some advocated for a more decisive military intervention, others were reluctant, fearful of repeating the mistakes of the past. The shadow of the failed interventions in Vietnam and Korea loomed over the deliberations. Could military intervention be perceived as an occupation rather than humanitarian aid? the international community found itself trapped in an ethical dilemma that challenged its principles. In 1995, after a series of atrocities and the collapse of peace negotiations, the international community was finally compelled to act. The intervention of NATO in Bosnia, although late, marked a turning point. However, the question persisted: had it come too late? The repercussions of this intervention would be felt in the years to come. But the legacy of the decisions made during those days of uncertainty still remained an enigma. The immediate consequences of international actions were both positive and negative. While NATO's intervention helped to end hostilities in Bosnia, the lack of a clear strategy for reconstruction and reconciliation left deep scars. The international community had awakened, but the shadows of hatred and division continued to lurk beneath the surface. This chapter of Balkan history raises questions that still resonate. Could the international community have done more to prevent the bloodshed? Was the intervention an act of altruism or a geopolitical strategy? The echo of these questions continues to reverberate in the halls of global politics, challenging leaders to confront their legacy. As world powers prepared to address the humanitarian and political crisis in the region, a new chapter in the history of the Balkans was beginning. The next stage, marked by the intervention of the United Nations and the complicated efforts to establish peace, would reveal even more the challenges that the international community would face. Would they be able to learn from the mistakes of the past and forge a path towards stability in a region torn apart by conflict? The humanitarian crisis would soon attract international attention, forcing an intervention that promised to restore peace in a territory torn apart by war. In a context where ethnic and political tensions had become unsustainable, the United Nations decided to deploy peacekeeping forces in the Balkans, a move that would bring with it a series of challenges, ethical dilemmas, and significant failures. By the end of the 1990s, the echoes of conflicts resonated strongly on the international stage. The images of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, with its devastation and human suffering, had crossed oceans, impacting governments and citizens alike. The international community, facing criticism for its inaction during the early years of the war, found itself in urgent need of action. The United Nations, as the body responsible for preserving peace and international security, became the last resort to attempt to mitigate the suffering of the civilian population caught in the midst of violence. The deployment of United Nations peacekeeping forces began in 1992. The troops, composed mainly of soldiers from European and Canadian countries, faced a hostile and chaotic environment. The mandate of the United Nations was clear in theory, but the reality on the ground was a multifaceted enigma. With a mandate of peace enforcement, these soldiers were expected to act as a bulwark against violence. However, the lack of resources, the ambiguity of their mandates, and the complexity of ethnic loyalties in the region greatly complicated their mission. Among the key actors in this phase was the then Secretary-General of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali. His vision of a humanitarian intervention was ambitious, but its implementation encountered the harsh reality of the conflict. Decisions made in the upper echelons of the United Nations often overlooked the peculiarities of the situation in the Balkans, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Could the United Nations peacekeeping forces really make a difference in such a deeply rooted conflict? The missions of the United Nations, such as the United Nations Protection Force, were intended to protect civilians and ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid. However, it soon became evident that these forces were at a disadvantage. The lack of a robust mandate and the reluctance to use force when necessary led to a stalemate that left many adrift. The situation became even more critical when, in 1995, the Siege of Srebrenica became one of the most notorious tragedies that would test the credibility of the United Nations intervention. Despite being designated as a safe area, the city was overrun by Serbian forces, resulting in the deaths of more than 8,000 Bosnian men and boys. The inaction of the United Nations peacekeeping forces during this massacre left the world questioning: How could this happen under the protection of the United Nations? The events in Srebrenica resonated around the world like a cry of desperation, forcing the international community to re-evaluate its strategies. The outrage generated by the massacre led to a shift in focus in international intervention, but not without leaving a persistent shadow over the credibility of the United Nations. The decisions made at that time not only affected the course of the war, but also raised questions about the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions in intractable conflicts. What lessons could be learned from the tragedy of Srebrenica and from the United Nations intervention in general? As the situation in the Balkans continued its turbulent course, the consequences of the United Nations intervention became evident. Although progress was made in establishing safe zones and delivering humanitarian aid, the peacekeeping forces found themselves caught in a power struggle that often transcended their control. The dilemma between protecting the civilian population and the need to act in a complex environment became a moral enigma that still endures. The immediate impact of these events was profound. The United Nations, despite its best intentions, found itself in the crosshairs of fiercely justified criticism. The credibility of the organization was put to the test, and the echoes of inaction resonated in the halls of international institutions for years. The question that lingered was, can the international community truly intervene effectively in internal conflicts without further exacerbating violence? In this context, the mystery of the effectiveness of the United Nations intervention in the Balkans becomes an enigma that invites reflection. Was the United Nations a mere powerless spectator in the face of horror, or were there strategic decisions that could have changed the course of events? What secrets still awaited in the depths of international bureaucracy and in the heart of humanitarian intervention? As we delve into the next chapter, we will begin to unravel how the intervention of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, through a different approach, attempted to address the crises that the United Nations failed to contain. Could international military support change the course of Balkan history, or would it simply be another chapter in the saga of suffering and conflict? The international paralysis would soon attract the attention of military powers, whose decisions would intertwine with the fate of the Balkans. The intervention of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, would become a crucial chapter in the history of these conflicts. In an environment where the echo of bullets still resonated and the flames of war consumed hope, the arrival of NATO promised change, although not without its own shadows. The decade of the 1990s witnessed an unprecedented collapse in the political structure of Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic state that had maintained a fragile peace for decades. With the outbreak of war, ethnic tensions became a battlefield. The disappearance of this Balkan giant left a void that unleashed uncontrollable chaos, as factions fought for control of territories and resources. The world watched with growing concern. The international community, largely paralyzed by the complexity of the situation, faced a dilemma: to intervene or to remain on the sidelines. Amidst this uncertainty, NATO emerged as a force willing to act. The decision to intervene was driven not only by a desire to restore peace, but also by the imperative to prevent a conflict that could extend beyond Yugoslav borders. The United States administration, under the leadership of President Bill Clinton, played a key role in advocating for military intervention. This push was reinforced by increasing internal and external pressure, especially after the horrifying images of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, which sparked global outrage. Among the key figures in this complex puzzle was the NATO Secretary-General, Javier Solana, whose decisions would be crucial in planning the intervention. Also notable was General Wesley Clark, designated to lead NATO forces. Clark, with a pragmatic approach and solid military experience, faced the titanic task of coordinating an operation in such a fractured and volatile terrain. But how prepared were they really to confront the challenges of an ongoing war? NATO's intervention began to take shape in the context of the Bosnian conflict. In 1995, in light of the growing humanitarian crisis and the suffering of the civilian population, the alliance decided to launch a series of airstrikes against Serbian positions in Bosnia. The operation, known as Deliberate Force, aimed to weaken the army of the Republika Srpska, led by Ratko Mladic, who had been accused of orchestrating atrocities in the areas under his control. NATO's response was forceful, but not without controversy. The intervention was presented as a humanitarian action, but it was also questioned whether NATO had crossed the line into becoming an actor in a conflict that was not strictly its responsibility. The air campaign, which began in August of 1995, unfolded in a context of growing despair. The attacks aimed to dismantle Serbian military capability and pressure the conflicting parties to come to the negotiating table. However, the effectiveness of the intervention was a subject of debate. Did NATO really succeed in stopping the violence, or did it simply exacerbate existing tensions? The outcome of this intervention was the Dayton Agreement, which in December of 1995 brought an end to the war in Bosnia. This pact, although celebrated as a triumph of international diplomacy, also left many questions in the air. NATO, by assuming a central role, had changed the course of Balkan history, but at a high cost. The consequences of the intervention extended beyond the temporary peace in the region. NATO's military presence in Bosnia, which materialized through the Implementation Force S4, became a symbol of the new geopolitical reality of the area. However, the enigma persists. Was NATO's intervention a necessary measure to end a devastating conflict, or did it become an instrument of geopolitical control that left a complicated legacy in the region? Ethnic tensions, resurgent nationalism, and the shadow of military intervention continue to be part of the social fabric of the Balkans. While the international community celebrated peace, many wondered whether history had truly closed a chapter or simply begun a new one. As the world focused on Bosnia, another conflict emerged on the horizon, the war in Kosovo. NATO's intervention in Bosnia had set a precedent, and the next act of this historical drama was about to unfold. What lessons would be learned from the experience in Bosnia, and how would these influence the impending crisis? The answers to these questions would be revealed in the next chapter, where the echo of a new conflict would begin to resonate in the Balkans. The military intervention would bring the Balkan region to a decisive turning point. As the flames of war continued to consume Bosnia and Herzegovina, the echo of devastation resonated not only in the mountains and cities of the region, but also in the corridors of power around the world. The need for a ceasefire became more urgent than ever, and thus, amid chaos and despair, the hope for an agreement that could end this nightmare emerged: the Dayton Agreement. By the end of 1995, Bosnia had been devastated by a conflict that had unleashed ethnic violence and horror. The population, divided among Bosniaks, Serbs and Croats, had suffered the consequences of a confrontation that seemed endless. Cities lay in ruins, battlefields stretched across the nation, and communities once united found themselves fragmented by distrust and hatred. In this context, Western powers, which had previously hesitated to intervene, began to feel the weight of responsibility and the pressure to act. Images of war, ethnic cleansing, and the Siege of Sarajevo had captured the world's attention, and the international community was compelled to reconsider its stance. In particular, the United States and the European Union became key players in the search for a solution. The administration of President Bill Clinton, driven by the desire to end a humanitarian crisis that worsened day by day, sent its special envoy, Richard Holbrooke, to the region. Holbrooke would become the architect of a negotiation process that, although fraught with tensions and challenges, promised a way out of the labyrinth of war. Thus, in the heart of the conflict, the enigma of how to achieve peace in a land torn apart by war began to take shape. Richard Holbrooke, a charismatic and persuasive diplomat, would become the central figure in these negotiations. His direct approach and ability to maneuver among the complex power dynamics made him indispensable. Beside him were the leaders of the conflicting factions: Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović, Croatian leader Franjo Tudjman, and Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic, who negotiated on behalf of the Bosnian Serbs. Each of them brought not only their own agenda, but also the weight of the expectations of their respective peoples. The decisions these leaders would make in the following weeks would be crucial. While Izetbegovic sought unity and sovereignty for Bosnia, Milosevic defended Serbian interests in Bosnian territory. For his part, Tudjman, who had already succeeded in establishing an independent Croatia, had his own strategic interests in the region. The complexity of the negotiations was heightened by mutual distrust and the pain of losses suffered, creating a tense atmosphere where old wounds reopened. The negotiations formally began on the 1st of November in 1995 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. Isolated from the outside world, the leaders found themselves in an environment that, despite its distance, felt charged with tensions. The discussions were intense and often became heated, the history and collective memory of each group intertwined in every word. Challenging the possibility of an agreement, Holbrooke, aware that time was running out, employed pressure and persuasion tactics. He organized negotiation sessions that often extended late into the night. However, the solution was not found solely in diplomacy. There was also a military component. The intervention of NATO, which had threatened to attack Serbian positions if negotiations failed, contributed to instilling a sense of urgency in the dialogues. On the 10th of November, after days of intense conversations, a preliminary agreement was reached. The parties agreed to divide Bosnia and Herzegovina into two entities: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska. This territorial design, although controversial, promised a ceasefire and a roadmap toward peace. But could it truly endure over time? The shadow of distrust still loomed over the negotiators. Finally, on the 14th of December in 1995, after weeks of hard work, the Dayton Agreement was signed. The ceremony took place in Paris, a symbol of hope for renewal in a region marked by war. With the signing of this treaty, it seemed that a dark chapter in the history of the Balkans had been closed. But like every war story, the real challenge was just beginning. The signing of the Dayton Agreement brought a sigh of relief to the international community. Implementation mechanisms were established, and NATO troops were sent to ensure peace. However, the reality on the ground was much more complex. Ethnic division, although formalized, remained a significant obstacle to reconciliation. Tensions between communities did not disappear overnight. Instead, they became a burden that the new institutions had to address carefully. Political leaders, now in power thanks to peace, faced the dilemma of how to build a shared future. Distrust persisted, and the scars of war remained visible in every corner of society. Could different ethnic groups truly coexist in the same country? Or would the legacy of war become a perpetual echo of division and resentment? The Dayton Agreement marked a milestone in the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it also left many questions unresolved. What secrets awaited in the depths of collective memory? Could peace truly endure on such fragile ground? As the country took its first steps toward reconstruction, the echo of the past continued to resonate, and the open wounds required deeper treatment than mere words on paper. In the distance, a new conflict began to take shape. The echoes of war in Kosovo were already felt in the air, and the instability of the Balkans seemed far from resolution. As the shadows of history lengthened, the path toward lasting peace grew increasingly uncertain. The question that lingered in the air was, could the region truly heal, or would it be forever trapped in a cycle of violence? Thus, the story of the Balkans would continue its course, leading us to the next stage of this enigma, the Kosovo War, where new struggles for identity and territory would erupt on a stage already worn by conflict. Peace in Bosnia did not mean the end of the crisis, as its echoes would soon spread throughout the region. On the threshold of the 1990s, Kosovo, a province in the heart of the Balkans, was becoming the stage for a conflict that would unveil the shadows of ethnic identity and the struggle for self-determination. The growing tension between the Serbian and Albanian communities in Kosovo marked the beginning of the Kosovo War, a crucial episode that would not only transform the political landscape of the region but also leave deep scars on the collective memory. Contextually, Kosovo had been part of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, a state composed of various nationalities and ethnicities. However, as tensions escalated and the Yugoslav structure crumbled, the situation in Kosovo became increasingly volatile. The Albanian population, which constituted approximately 90% of the province's inhabitants, began to demand greater rights and autonomy from a Serbian government that was reluctant to cede power. The policies of discrimination and repression implemented by Belgrade under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic stoked the flames of discord. Thus, the climate of instability and social discontent would transform into an open conflict. In this context, key figures emerged who would play decisive roles in the development of the war. One of the most prominent actors was Ibrahim Rugova, leader of the Albanian movement in Kosovo and a central figure of the Democratic Party of Kosovo. Rugova advocated for peaceful and non-violent resistance, seeking international recognition of Albanian rights. However, his approach would be challenged by the emergence of the Kosovo Liberation Army, an armed group that opted for armed struggle as a means to achieve its goals. In the face of increasing repression from Serbian forces, the Kosovo Liberation Army became a symbol of Albanian resistance, resulting in the polarization of the situation and an increase in violence. By the end of 1997, the Kosovo Liberation Army began to carry out attacks against Serbian forces, marking the start of an escalation in the conflict. In response, the Serbian government intensified its repression, implementing tactics of ethnic cleansing that would become one of the darkest features of the war. The international community, which had already witnessed the devastation in Bosnia, began to pay attention to the crisis brewing in Kosovo. But would this attention be enough to prevent a new humanitarian disaster? Events unfolded rapidly. In March of 1998, Serbian forces launched a massive offensive in the Drenica region, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Albanians and the destruction of entire villages. Violence became a vicious cycle, with the Kosovo Liberation Army responding with attacks on Serbian forces and the Serbian army increasing its brutality in an attempt to suppress the insurgency. Images of refugees and the devastation of communities began to flood the media, and the echo of cries for help resonated in the halls of international institutions. As the conflict intensified, the world began to question the role of the international community. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe attempted to mediate, but efforts were futile in the face of the intransigence of both parties. In this context, NATO's intervention would become an increasingly plausible option. But what consequences would a military intervention have in a conflict so deeply rooted in the history and identity of the peoples? The immediate consequences of the conflict were devastating. By the summer of 1998, it was estimated that more than 200,000 people had been displaced, and violence had claimed thousands of lives. The situation was becoming unsustainable, and the world watched with growing concern as Kosovo became a new stage of human suffering. The international community faced a moral and political dilemma: to act or to allow history to repeat itself once again. The enigma of the chapter hovers over the question of what the outcome might have been if the parties had found a path toward dialogue and reconciliation instead of violence. Could the war have been avoided if peaceful solutions had been explored with greater determination? The answers remain in the air, like shadows in the collective memory. As the echoes of war resonated and the situation became increasingly critical, the next chapter of this story was about to unfold. NATO's air intervention in Kosovo loomed, an act that would not only change the course of the conflict but also leave an indelible mark on the history of the Balkans. What decisions would be made in the command centres? And what repercussions would this intervention have on the future of the region? History was ready to reveal itself. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. the crisis in Kosovo would soon escalate into a new and devastating chapter in the history of the Balkans. In 1999, the conflict reached a boiling point that would resonate on the international stage and mark a turning point in military intervention policy. The violence and systematic repression by Slobodan Milosevic's regime against the Albanian population of Kosovo had triggered a massive exodus and a global outcry for action. In this context, NATO's air intervention emerged as an enigma of complex decisions, where ethics, strategy, and power intertwined in unforeseen ways. The political and social environment in which this intervention unfolded was deeply unstable. Kosovo, a province of Serbia, had been the epicenter of ethnic tensions that dated back centuries. While the world looked on with concern, the Albanian population of Kosovo suffered under a regime that sought to suppress their cultural and political identity. The atrocities committed by Serbian forces, including murders, forced displacements, and the destruction of homes, brought the region to the brink of a humanitarian disaster. The images of refugees crossing the border in search of safety became a deafening echo that reached decision-making halls in Washington, Brussels, and other capitals around the world. In this context, NATO leaders, led by Secretary-General Javier Solana, faced a crucial decision. After months of fruitless negotiations and the ineffectiveness of diplomacy, the Atlantic Alliance opted for a military response. On the 24th of March in 1999, Operation Allied Force began, an air campaign that would last 78 days. This campaign marked the first time NATO carried out a military intervention without the approval of the United Nations Security Council, a fact that would generate controversy and debate about the legitimacy of its actions. Strategic decisions were made in an atmosphere of pressure and urgency. NATO leaders, including United States President Bill Clinton, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and French President Jacques Chirac, played decisive roles in formulating the military strategy. But was this decision the right one? As the bombings intensified, the question became a moral dilemma. Were the innocent lives that would be lost in the process justified by the goal of stopping ethnic cleansing? History has left a legacy of questioning the ethics of war and the responsibility of leaders. Events unfolded in a nearly cinematic manner. In the early stages of the operation, NATO focused on destroying military and strategic infrastructure of Serbian forces. As days turned into weeks, images of devastation began to emerge. Burning buildings, destroyed factories, and the civilian population caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, Milosevic's regime responded with even greater brutality, intensifying its campaign of repression and committing atrocities that would add to a growing body of evidence of war crimes. On the 10th of June in 1999, after nearly 3 months of bombings, NATO achieved a ceasefire. Serbian forces withdrew from Kosovo and the territory was placed under United Nations administration. However, the immediate consequences of the air intervention were profound and difficult to measure. Thousands of civilians had lost their lives, and the Albanian population of Kosovo, although liberated from Serbian repression, faced a new reality of instability and violence. The intervention had created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by armed groups and militias, leading to a new cycle of violence that would overshadow peace. The enigma of NATO's intervention in Kosovo persists. Was the action necessary to stop a humanitarian crisis, or was the human cost too high? The story of these events cannot be told without considering the voices of those who lived through the conflict, those who lost everything, and those who became witnesses to the brutality of war. In the echo of the bombings, an unanswered question can be heard. Can one truly intervene in the name of peace without leaving indelible scars? As we delve into the next chapter, we will explore the end of the war in Kosovo and how the cessation of hostilities led to a resolution that, despite everything, left a complicated legacy in the region. What new challenges would arise on the path to peace and reconstruction? The story of Kosovo was just beginning, and its echoes would continue to resonate in the hearts of its people. The military intervention would soon transform into a frantic search for peace. As the bombs of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization resonated in the skies of Kosovo, an atmosphere of despair and longing for a solution took hold of the region. It was 1999, and the conflict that had torn Kosovo apart for years was approaching a turning point. The international community, exhausted by the conflict and the atrocities that accompanied it, was preparing to put an end to a chapter of suffering and displacement. The political and social context of this period was complex. Kosovo, a province in the heart of the Balkan Peninsula, had been the scene of an ethnic conflict that had escalated into an open war between the Kosovo Liberation Army, composed mainly of ethnic Albanians, and Serbian forces which defended the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic. The history of Kosovo had been woven with threads of national pride and memories of ancient battles. But now it was marked by violence and repression. Ethnic tensions had erupted into a conflict that left thousands dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. Among the key actors in this story was Milosevic himself, whose nationalist rhetoric had fanned the flames of the conflict. His decision to brutally suppress the Albanian insurgency in 1998 had triggered a series of events that would lead to the military intervention of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On the other side, figures such as Hashim Thaçi, leader of the Kosovo Liberation Army, stood as symbols of Albanian resistance, fighting not only for autonomy but for the recognition of a state of their own. The decisions of both leaders, in their respective contexts, would play a crucial role in the outcome of this war. The development of events during the ceasefire period was tumultuous. In March of 1999, peace negotiations in Rambouillet, France, seemed to offer a way out of the crisis. However, irreconcilable differences between the parties led to the failure of the dialogues. Faced with the imminent humanitarian catastrophe and the lack of diplomatic progress, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization made the decision to initiate an air bombing campaign on March 24, 1999. This intervention, aimed at halting the Serbian advance and protecting Albanian civilians, marked a new chapter in the history of the Balkans. The skies of Kosovo darkened with the echo of fighter planes and explosions. For 78 days, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization carried out an intense bombing campaign that caused significant damage to military and civilian infrastructures. Serbian resistance, although initially effective, began to crumble under the constant pressure of the attacks. In this context, on June 10, 1999, the war came to an end. The Serbian forces, defeated and with morale at an all-time low, agreed to withdraw from Kosovo, thus marking the cessation of hostilities. The immediate consequences of this outcome were profound. The arrival of United Nations forces and the implementation of the United Nations Interim Administration mission in Kosovo established a new order in the region. However, peace was fragile and the legacy of war endured. Kosovo found itself in a state of chaos, with ethnic tensions still simmering and a traumatized population. The withdrawal of Serbian forces left a vacuum that would soon be filled by an Albanian population seeking justice and redress. The enigma behind the end of the Kosovo War lies in the questions that persist regarding the decisions made during this critical period. Could the military intervention of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization have been avoided? Or was it inevitable given the context of violence and repression? The answers to these questions not only reveal the complexities of the conflict, but also reflect the dilemmas faced by leaders in times of crisis. As the shadows of the past continued to loom, the next chapter delves into the political transition in Serbia, exploring how the end of the war marked the beginning of a new approach in the country's internal and external relations. Could the pain of the past become an opportunity for reconstruction and reconciliation? The history of the Balkans continues, and with it, the echo of the decisions that shaped an uncertain future. The end of the war would give way to a period of political transformation in Serbia, a country that had lived in the shadow of conflict and oppression for more than a decade. With the fall of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000, A new chapter in Serbian history opened, one marked by the hope for radical change and the search for a democratic identity. The historical context that preceded this change was bleak. The decade of the 90s was marked by violence and the disintegration of Milosevic's regime, which had led the country with an iron fist, fueling Serbian nationalism and perpetuating the war in the Balkans. The economy collapsed, international sanctions were imposed, and society fragmented, engulfed in fear and distrust. In this atmosphere of despair, civil resistance began to gain strength. Young people, intellectuals, and dissidents started to organize, seeking a way out of oppression. Massive demonstrations such as those that took place in Belgrade in October of 2000 demonstrated that the flame of resistance still burned in the heart of the Serbian people. The protagonists of this period of change would be figures such as Vojislav Koštunica, leader of the Democratic Party of Serbia, who became a symbol of the opposition against the regime. With his rise, crucial questions arose. Could Koštunica be the beacon of hope that Serbia needed, or was he simply a new face of a system that still struggled to free itself from the shadows of the past? The electoral victory over Milosevic was celebrated in the streets, where thousands of Serbians erupted in the euphoria of newly conquered freedom. However, the path would not be easy. Koštunica made key decisions that would define the country's course. He opted for a coalition with left and right parties, seeking a balance that would allow him to remain in power. The promise of a democratic and European Serbia resonated in speeches, but the shadows of the old regime still weighed on the institutions. The question of Kosovo, an open wound in the Serbian heart, remained a delicate issue that required immediate attention. Would it be possible to reconcile the yearning for Europe with the burden of nationalism? Could a democratic Serbia find peace with its past? Events unfolded rapidly. In the year 2001, the arrest of Milosevic in Belgrade and his subsequent extradition to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia marked a turning point. This act was seen as a symbol of the definitive break with the past, but it also raised questions about the future. Would it be enough to heal the wounds of Serbian society, or would it create new divisions? The immediate consequences of these events were profound. The Serbian population began to experience a sense of fresh air with the hope that European integration could be a tangible reality. However, the legacy of war and structural corruption remained significant obstacles. The new government faced governance challenges, while ethnic tensions did not completely fade away. The question that resonated in the air was, could Serbia truly rebuild itself and reconcile with its multiple identities? In this context of uncertainty, a central enigma emerged. Would it be possible for Serbia, a nation marked by conflict and division, to find a path toward unity and peace? As the country moved toward European integration, internal tensions and the legacies of war continued to lurk in the shadows, challenging the stability of the new political order. The political transition in Serbia, filled with contradictions and hopes, left a trail of unanswered questions. The ambition for a peaceful future faced the complex realities of a violent past. With its gaze fixed on the reconstruction of a nation, the decisions and actions of Serbian leaders would continue to shape the country's destiny in the years to come. As the mystery of political transformation in Serbia unfolded, the Balkan region began to look forward. The reconstruction of nations affected by conflicts loomed as the next great stage. But what challenges and dilemmas awaited on that uncertain path? The political transition would soon reveal the magnitude of the challenge faced by the nations of the Balkans. With the dust of conflict still settling, a new enigma arose: how to rebuild what had been devastated. The reconstruction of the Balkans was not merely a matter of erecting buildings, it was a monumental effort to restore trust and social cohesion in a region marked by deep resentments and open wounds. The historical context of this reconstruction lies in the echo of bullets and the cries of the displaced. By the late 1990s, the aftermath of the Balkan Wars had left a desolate landscape. Cities such as Sarajevo, Mostar and Pristina stood as ghosts of their former splendor, with destroyed infrastructures and fractured communities. The outbreak of violence had eroded not only the physical foundations of these nations, but also the social fabric that united them. Distrust had taken root among the various ethnicities, and the pain of loss remained palpable in every corner. The question that resonated in the air was, how could peace be restored in a place where war had been so omnipresent? In the face of this grim panorama, a series of key figures and decisions emerged that would shape the course of Reconstruction. One of the most significant actors was the then United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Sadako Ogata. Her leadership in coordinating humanitarian efforts and her insistence on the importance of reconciliation played a crucial role. Alongside her, local leaders such as Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović and Croatian Prime Minister Ivica Račan found themselves at a crossroads, compelled to make difficult decisions that would define the future of their nations. The need for international assistance became evident, and European powers, along with the United States, began to take a renewed interest in the region, driven by the urgency to prevent a new outbreak of violence. The unfolding of events in this context of Reconstruction was a complex and multifaceted process. In 1996, shortly after the signing of the Dayton Agreement, the Bosnia and Herzegovina Reconstruction Program was established, aiming not only for physical reconstruction but also for the reintegration of communities. Significant investments flowed into the region from the International Monetary Fund and the European Union. Economic development initiatives were promoted, including the construction of infrastructures, the rehabilitation of schools and hospitals, and the encouragement of employment. However, this process was not without obstacles. Corruption and administrative inefficiency became shadows threatening to undermine the progress achieved. Meanwhile, in Kosovo, the arrival of NATO peacekeeping forces in 1999 marked a turning point. The United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo was established with the mandate to provide temporary governance and facilitate reconstruction. This effort was accompanied by a series of projects aimed at restoring critical infrastructure and fostering reconciliation between Serbs and Albanians. However, the path to stability was tortuous, ethnic tensions persisted, and the return of the displaced often became a painful and complicated process. The immediate consequences of these reconstruction efforts were evident. In many places, buildings began to rise and communities started to glimpse a more hopeful future. However, physical reconstruction did not automatically translate into the recovery of social cohesion. The legacy of war continued to resonate in interethnic relations, and fear and distrust did not vanish overnight. The question lingered: could the nations of the Balkans truly overcome their past and build a shared future? The enigma of this chapter lies in the complexity of reconstruction in the Balkans. The region found itself at a crossroads where physical reconstruction and emotional healing seemed to be two sides of the same coin, yet often clashed in their pursuit of lasting peace. What secrets remained hidden in the shadows of a recent past? Was it possible for the memory of war to become a bridge to reconciliation, or would it continue to be a wall separating its peoples? As the region attempted to rise from the ashes of conflict, a new chapter began to be written: the trial of war criminals. The still open wounds of the Balkan Wars demanded answers, and the quest for justice would become a central theme in the narrative of Reconstruction. Could these trials bring a sense of closure, or on the contrary, reignite old resentments? History still had much to reveal. The reconstruction of the Balkans, however, was not limited to the material sphere. The need for justice emerged as a persistent echo among the ruins of a heartbreaking conflict. The shadow of war crimes loomed over the region, bringing with it the imperative demand for accountability. Judicial processes against leaders and military personnel accused of war crimes would become a battleground of moral and legal confrontation. In an attempt to unravel the dark legacy of violence and hatred, the historical context that preceded these trials was steeped in ethnic tensions and a profound distrust among communities. The disintegration of Yugoslavia had left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by extremism and exacerbated nationalism. In this environment, atrocities were committed that blurred the line between war and crime. Images of ethnic cleansing, systematic rapes, and indiscriminate killings were etched into the collective memory, creating an urgent clamour for justice. But how could this justice be achieved in a world where truths were so easily manipulated and the victors wrote history? Among the actors who would emerge as protagonists of this judicial drama was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Established in 1993 by the United Nations Security Council, the tribunal was created with the mission of prosecuting those responsible for serious violations of international humanitarian law. Its initial steps were hesitant, marked by resistance and a lack of political will from some states. However, the determination of certain international actors, along with the pressing desire of victims to see justice, propelled the creation of a legal framework aimed at clarifying the horrors of the past. Among the main defendants, Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Serbia, emerged as a symbol of Serbian nationalism and the atrocities committed during the wars. His arrest in 2001 was a decisive moment. Accused of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, his trial became a media spectacle that captured the attention of a world eager to understand the conflict. However, the figure of Milosevic was complex. Was he truly the sole responsible party for the devastation, or was he the visible face of a much broader and entrenched system? As the trials progressed, other leaders were also brought to justice. Radovan Karadzic, former political leader of the Bosnian Serbs, and Ratko Mladic, commander of the army of the Republika Srpska, were similarly pursued. Their trials revealed not only the brutality of the actions committed, but also the insidious planning behind them. The recordings, testimonies, and documents presented in court offered a heartbreaking insight into the strategy that underpinned ethnic cleansing. But was it enough to satisfy the yearning for justice of the victims and their families? The development of these trials, however, was not without controversy. As evidence was unveiled, debates erupted regarding the impartiality of the tribunal and the interpretation of the facts. The defense of Milosevic, for example, argued that the tribunal was biased against him, presenting his case as a struggle for Serbian sovereignty in a Western world that had turned its back on the region. The political and diplomatic dynamics further complicated the scenario. The interventions of Western powers, which had played a role in the military intervention in Kosovo, were also scrutinized. Was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia a truly impartial vehicle for justice, or merely an instrument of power in the hands of those seeking to legitimize their own actions? The immediate consequences of these trials were profound. For many, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia symbolized a ray of hope, an attempt to put an end to the impunity that had characterized the wars in the Balkans. However, the process of justice also reignited old wounds and tensions in an already fractured region. Communities began to polarize even further, some supporting the tribunal while others viewed it as an attack on their identity and history. The echo of justice seemed to resonate in an atmosphere of distrust where truths were multiple and often contradictory. As the trials unfolded, a troubling enigma emerged. Could justice truly heal the deep wounds of war? Questions about forgiveness and reconciliation became increasingly urgent. Criminal justice, while necessary, seemed insufficient to address the complex web of traumas and suffering that had marked the communities. What would happen to those who had lost their loved ones? And to those who had been responsible for atrocious acts? The legacy of the trials became a topic of intense debate. Many wondered if justice could truly exist amid such a deeply rooted and painful conflict. The enigma of the chapter leaves the viewer with a fundamental question. Is it possible to build a future of peace and reconciliation on the ashes of such a violent past? As the nations of the Balkans attempt to find their way towards stability, the search for justice remains a recurring theme. However, the path to reconciliation is a thorny one, where the echoes of the past resonate in every political and social decision. As the region enters a new chapter, the pursuit of reconciliation among the various ethnic communities becomes the next challenge to face. Can the nations of the Balkans leave behind the weight of their history and move toward a future in peace? The search for justice and truth would soon intertwine with another deep yearning, reconciliation. In the years following the heartbreaking conflicts that shook the Balkans, the echo of gunfire left a void that cried out for understanding and peace. The wounds opened by war were evident, not only in the visible scars of the devastated land, but also in the torn social fabric of communities that once coexisted in relative harmony. In this context, the challenge of promoting reconciliation among the diverse ethnic communities became a primary objective, a historical puzzle that required the ingenuity of leaders, the courage of civil society, and the intervention of international actors. The political and social environment preceding these efforts was tense and complex. After the signing of the Dayton Agreement in 1995, which ended the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the path to peace had not been fully paved. The communities, divided along ethnic lines, carried with them not only the weight of the collective memory of suffering, but also the distrust and resentment that the war had fueled. The physical reconstruction of cities like Sarajevo and Mostar was overshadowed by the need to rebuild the human bonds that had been destroyed. In this delicate landscape, key figures emerged who would become beacons of hope and often solitary voices amid the clamour of hatred. One of them was the then president of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegović, who amidst the ruins of war proclaimed the importance of unity among Muslims, Serbs and Croats. His call for reconciliation resonated at a time when the country was still marked by hatred and pain. But could a single leader truly change the course of history? At the same time, figures like Cardinal Vinko Puljic and Serbian Bishop Amfilohije Radović worked quietly, trying to forge bridges between religious communities. Reminding their congregants that forgiveness is a path to recovery. The decisions made by these leaders, although brave, were not simple. The pressure from the more radical factions within their own communities often limited their actions. The establishment of the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation in Bosnia, an effort to document war crimes and give voice to survivors, was a significant step toward healing. However, this initiative faced resistance from those who preferred to maintain silence about the past, fearful that the truth could unleash new waves of violence. Was forgiveness truly possible in a place where every corner recalled the pain? As the years progressed, civil society also began to play a crucial role in the search for reconciliation. Non-governmental organizations like Gariwo and the Post-Conflict Research Center began working on projects that promoted intercultural dialogue and education about peace through workshops, exhibitions, and community activities. They sought to break the stigmas that had arisen during the war. The narratives of young people from different ethnicities intertwined in an effort to build a shared future. But could these initiatives truly dismantle the shadows of the past? One of the most emblematic events of this search was the Sarajevo meeting in 2004, where survivors from different communities gathered to share their stories. This event, filled with emotion and tears, became a symbol of hope. However, despite the shared tears and embraces, the path to reconciliation remained fraught with challenges. Distrust persisted, and in many cases, hate speech resurfaced in political spheres, reminding everyone that the past was not so easily forgotten. The immediate consequences of these efforts were mixed. While some individuals began to forge interethnic relationships, many communities remained isolated, clinging to their narratives of victimization. Polarization remained evident in opinion polls, where a significant portion of the population expressed skepticism about the possibility of true coexistence. The enigma of reconciliation grew deeper. How could progress be made when the past continued to be a monster lurking in the shadows? In this context, the question that arises is, Is it possible to heal the wounds of a conflict that left indelible scars? The various initiatives, although well-intentioned, often faced the harsh reality of distrust and fear. The shadow of war remained present, not only in the psyche of individuals, but also in the very structure of the institutions that sought to guide society toward a more peaceful future. The search for reconciliation in the Balkans thus presents itself as an enigma, a labyrinth of efforts that, while promising, do not always manage to overcome the resistance of the past. The question that lingers in the air is whether the history of pain and suffering can be transformed into a legacy of peace and unity. What paths must be taken for once divided communities to find common ground on which to build a shared future? Thus, while the shadows of the past still loom over the region, the story of reconciliation in the Balkans continues its course, hinting at the possibility of a new dawn. In the next chapter, we will explore the lasting impact of the wars on the politics and society of the region, a legacy that continues to shape the lives of millions. Will we see a future where peace prevails over conflict? The answer lies in the echoes of the past and in the decisions that the new generation will make. The search for reconciliation and reconstruction that began to take shape could not escape the shadows cast over the legacy of the Balkan Wars, a legacy that even today resonates in the political and social fabric of the region. In this chapter, we will delve into the lasting impact of the conflicts that ravaged these territories, where the echo of bullets and cries of pain still seem to resonate in the streets and in the hearts of their inhabitants. The historical context preceding this analysis is an amalgamation of suffering and transformations. The Balkan Wars not only destroyed lives and cities, but also fractured the social and political structures of the region. Following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the power vacuum left each of the new nations struggling to define their identity in an environment where ethnic loyalty often surpassed nationalism. The fall of Slobodan Milosevic's regime in Serbia, although a step towards democratization, left a country divided between those who wished to move towards Europe and those who still longed for the old glories of a now extinct empire. This complex panorama was shaped by key figures who played decisive roles. Among them was Vojislav Koštunica, who emerged as a reformist leader, and Radovan Karadzic, whose shadow loomed like a cloak of terror following the war crimes in Bosnia. The decisions made by these men, and many others, not only marked the course of their respective nations, but also laid the groundwork for future conflicts. The lack of accountability, impunity, and the absence of a true reconciliation process became the foundations of an enigmatic legacy that still endures. The unfolding of events in this narrative of legacy is an intertwined tale of hopes and disillusionments. The decade of the 1990s was a stage where hatred and vengeance translated into acts of systematic violence, but also where the international community began to intervene, albeit often in a delayed and erratic manner. As the wounds of war began to heal, social and political movements promoting peace and cooperation emerged, such as the Balkan Initiative, which sought to integrate the countries of the region within a framework of collaboration. However, the path to peace was obstructed by heightened nationalism and resentment towards former enemies. The immediate consequences of these events were profound and varied. The new political borders not only redefined geography, but also reconfigured interethnic relations. Forced migration, the creation of homogeneous communities, and the perpetuation of stereotypes became everyday realities. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Dayton Agreement, while celebrating peace, left in its wake a fragmented country where ethnic division was institutionalized in a political system that, ironically, sought to promote unity. But was it really so? Was the peace achieved more than a mere ceasefire, or was it simply a new prelude to future conflicts? The enigma of the chapter that emerges from this complex web is the question of the effectiveness of reconciliation and reconstruction strategies. Despite efforts to heal the wounds, had they truly managed to eradicate the hatred and distrust that had incubated during years of conflict? The scars of war, although invisible to some, remained alive in the collective imagination. feeding a cycle of resentment that threatened to resurface at any moment. Thus, the legacy of the Balkan Wars presents itself as a multifaceted phenomenon where the lessons of the past seem to repeat themselves in the present. While some nations advance towards European integration, others find themselves trapped in political and social disputes that resonate with echoes of the past. This legacy is undoubtedly a reminder that peace is not a destination, but a continuous process that requires effort and will. As we look ahead, it is crucial to understand the role that the European Union has played in this context. Can the European Union become the beacon of hope that guides these nations towards a future of stability and cooperation? Or will the shadows of the past continue to loom, preventing the forging of a true legacy of peace? The answer to this question leads us to the next chapter, where we will explore the influence of the European Union on the stabilization and post-conflict development of the region. The post-war crisis would soon attract the attention of a key player, the European Union. In a context where the shadows of war still loomed over the Balkans, the idea of European integration emerged as a flickering light in a tunnel of uncertainty. The region, torn by conflict and suffering, found itself at a crossroads. The possibility of a more stable and prosperous future seemed to depend on the decisions that would be made in the following years. By the late 1990s, the European Union was at a crossroads, seeking not only to expand its influence but also to consolidate its own identity on the world stage. The wars in the Balkans, with their devastating legacy of division and distrust, posed a monumental challenge for the organization, which was committed to playing a key role in the stabilization and reconstruction of this war-torn region. But could the European Union truly be the agent of change that these countries so desperately needed? European leaders faced a dilemma. In their quest for lasting peace, they were confronted with the need to address the roots of the conflict. It was evident that the military approach of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the humanitarian interventions of the United Nations had been necessary steps, but insufficient. The reconstruction of the Balkans required a more holistic approach that addressed not only security but also the economy, politics, and above all, interethnic relations. In this context, key figures began to emerge, such as the then Commissioner for Enlargement of the European Union, Günther Verheugen, who became an advocate for European integration as a means to heal the wounds of the past. The crucial decisions of the European Union at this stage included the implementation of economic aid programs and the promotion of political reforms in the countries of the region. The creation of the Stabilization and Association process in 1999 marked a milestone in the European commitment to the Balkans. This process not only offered the prospect of integration to the countries of the region, but also demanded a series of reforms aimed at fostering democracy, respect for human rights, and a market economy. However, these measures were not without criticism. Many questioned whether the European Union truly understood the complexity of the ethnic and political conflicts that had torn the region apart. As the decade of the 2000s progressed, events began to unfold rapidly. The approval of the Stabilization and Association Agreement by Croatia in 2001 and the signing of the Stabilization and Association Agreement of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2008 were undoubtedly significant steps towards integration. However, despite these advances, the shadow of distrust and resentment persisted. The wounds opened by the conflict were deep, and reconciliation among ethnic communities remained a slow and painful process. The tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, for example, only highlighted the fragility of the new European order. The immediate consequences of the intervention of the European Union were at first encouraging. Economies began to show signs of recovery, and democratic institutions were strengthened in several countries. But were the foundations for lasting peace truly being laid, or was a new facade simply being constructed to hide old grievances? Questions continued to arise, and the enigma of whether the European Union could truly transform the Balkans into a unified and peaceful region remained unanswered. As the European Union continued its work in the Balkans, A new challenge began to emerge, the perception of the youth growing up in this new era. Could these new European citizens really leave behind the legacy of their parents and grandparents? The history of the Balkans, rich in nuances and conflicts, continued to echo persistently in the collective consciousness of the region. The decisions made in Brussels and the reforms implemented on the ground had profound repercussions in the lives of millions of people. As the chapter of the European Union's influence in the Balkans closed, one question lingered in the air: what future awaited the new generations in a continent marked by the memory of past wars? The answer to this question could be the key to understanding the true legacy of the Balkan Wars and the path towards a future of peace. The next exploration will take us to the voices of those who grew up amid this turmoil to discover how they perceive history and the future that awaits them. The search for reconciliation and reconstruction in the Balkans could not be complete without considering those who inherited the legacy of the wars, the new generations. Growing up in a world marked by the visible and invisible traces of conflict, these young people face a puzzle that transcends the simple historical narrative. How do they relate to a past that often seems to be a distorted echo of their own reality? The Balkans in the 1990s emerged as a battleground where ideologies and identities intertwined in a whirlwind of violence and chaos. But once the echoes of the bullets began to fade, a new context emerged, one where youth not only wished to survive but also to understand the world around them. The end of the wars left a void, but also the space for hope and transformation. In this new landscape, young people found themselves confronting the shadow of a violent past, with the need to define their identity in an environment still shaken by the fears of yesteryear. Among the new voices of this generation, figures like Harshness stand out, a young woman from Sarajevo who, through her art, seeks to address the collective memory of the war and its impact on society. Her choices, opting for artistic creation as a form of expression, reflect a deep desire to confront the past and question the prevailing narratives. There is also Marko, a student from Belgrade who, through activism, challenges the nationalist narratives that still persist in his surroundings. These young people are not merely witnesses to a turbulent time, they are agents of change, attempting to rewrite a narrative that includes them, not as victims, but as protagonists of their own story. With the arrival of the new millennium, many of these new generations began to seek connections beyond their national borders. Cultural and social movements emerged, promoting dialogue and collaboration among young people from different ethnicities and nations. In cities like Sarajevo, Belgrade, and Pristina, music, art, and literature festivals began to flourish, challenging historical divisions. However, this process was not easy. The scars of the past remained present, and often tensions erupted into heated discussions about identity and memory. Technology also played a crucial role. Social media allowed young people to share their experiences and visions from a broader perspective, connecting realities that once seemed irreconcilable. However, this same tool also became a battleground for misinformation and manipulation, posing new challenges. Could this generation, armed with information, overcome the ghosts of the past that their elders had been unable to exorcise? The impact of these interactions and movements was palpable. As young people began to articulate their experiences, a new discourse emerged around peace, identity, and reconciliation. However, the path toward mutual acceptance was fraught with obstacles. Old wounds did not heal easily, and the fear of violence remained latent. The decisions made by these young people not only shaped their present but also laid the groundwork for the future of the region. Despite struggles and setbacks, the desire to build a new type of community, more inclusive and understanding, began to sprout. However, despite these efforts, a fundamental question lingers in the air. Can these new generations truly break the cycle of hatred and resentment? Or are they doomed to repeat history? As they seek answers, the echo of their predecessors' decisions resonates in their hearts and minds. The legacy of the wars is not a mere memory, it is a shadow that still influences their daily lives. As the new generations strive to make sense of a complex past, the path toward reconciliation remains filled with uncertainties. The history of the Balkans is not just a chronicle of wars and divisions. It is, above all, a quest for peace and identity in a world that continues to change. Historical memory intertwines with present reality, creating a fabric of experiences that defines not only individuals but an entire region. As we explore the impact of these new voices in the present, we confront the question of how the history of the Balkan Wars is remembered and taught today. How will those memories shape the identity of future generations? The answer to this enigma will lead us to the next chapter, where we will unravel the complex web of historical memory and its influence on the construction of a shared future. The identity crisis of the new generations would soon leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of the peoples of the Balkans. In this chapter, we delve into the complex layers of historical memory, where the teaching and remembrance of the Balkan Wars intertwine with national identity and the quest for reconciliation. In a landscape marked by scars still visible, the echo of past conflicts resonates today in classrooms, in political speeches, and in the daily lives of its inhabitants. The historical context surrounding the memory of the Balkan Wars is situated in an environment of tension and fragmentation. The wounds of the conflicts of the 1990s are still palpable in society. As nations rebuilt themselves, the challenge of defining what had happened, who was guilty and who was a victim, became a central theme. Political discourse is often intertwined with the narrative of memory, creating a space where history was constantly rewritten. In this context, the governments of the new states that emerged from the disintegration of Yugoslavia, such as Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, took on the responsibility of educating their citizens about their past, but each did so from a different perspective, often laden with nationalism. In this scenario, key figures emerge who have shaped the way history is remembered. From political leaders like Slobodan Milosevic, who used the rhetoric of historical suffering to justify his actions, to intellectuals and activists seeking to promote a more inclusive and reconciling narrative. Their decisions have left a profound mark on how current and future generations perceive the conflicts. How can the need to remember the past be reconciled with the desire to move towards a peaceful future? This question resonates in classrooms where educators struggle to find a balance between historical truth and the construction of a common identity. The development of events in the teaching of historical memory reveals a diversity of approaches. In Croatia, for example, there has been an emphasis on national resistance and heroism during the war, while in Bosnia the focus has been more on suffering and victimization. Narratives in Serbia often center on the idea of being the target of aggression, leaving little room for self-criticism. Decisions regarding school curricula and commemorative monuments reflect these tensions. In many cases, silence has been preferred over the war crimes committed by soldiers from their own countries, creating an atmosphere of denial that perpetuates the cycle of hatred. The immediate consequences of these educational decisions are palpable. In a country like Bosnia, where communities are divided not only by ethnic lines but also by the interpretation of their history, the lack of a common narrative has perpetuated distrust and animosity. Young people, who should be the bearers of a hopeful future, often grow up with opposing views of their past, fueling an endless cycle of resentment. But is this the only reality? Is it possible that history, with its burden of pain and suffering, can be transformed into a bridge towards reconciliation? The enigma surrounding the historical memory of the Balkan Wars becomes a mystery that persists over time. Each decision about how the past is remembered has the power to shape the present and the future. The question of who has the right to tell the story and how it should be told remains unanswered. As new generations take up the mantle, they face the challenge of unraveling a narrative that is both their heritage and their burden. In this labyrinth of memories, will they be able to find a path towards peace and unity? Or are they doomed to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors? Thus, the historical memory of the Balkan Wars is not just a subject of study, but a vital component of national identity that continues to evolve. In this context, the next chapter will take us to explore the current challenges facing these countries, where the shadows of the past still influence politics and society. How will these challenges manifest in the pursuit of a future of peace in the region? The answer lies in the very heart of the Balkans, where the echo of history still resonates. The conflicting historical memory would soon reveal itself as a labyrinth of political and social dilemmas that still persist in the Balkans. As the shadow of wars dissipates, new challenges emerge, leaving a persistent echo of uncertainty in the region. The Balkans, a land marked by its tumultuous history, today face intricate problems that affect their path toward peace and stability. In this context, the political environment of the Balkans has been influenced by decades of conflict, distrust, and a yearning for reconstruction. The wounds of the past have not completely healed. Instead, they often reopen upon contact with the current reality. Ethnic tensions remain latent, and political divisions have been maintained, often exacerbated by a lack of cooperation among the nations of the region. In this environment, aspirations for European integration collide with corruption, resurgent nationalism, and internal struggles for power. The key actors in this contemporary drama are diverse. Political leaders such as Aleksandar Vučić in Serbia, Zoran Zaev in North Macedonia, and Edi Rama in Albania have made decisions that seek to balance old rivalries with the need to move toward a more promising future. However, their choices are often clouded by the pressure from their respective bases, which demand a defense of national identity above regional cooperation. These power dynamics reflect a historical legacy that cannot be ignored, where fear and suspicion continue to shape the political discourse. In this landscape, recent events have demonstrated the fragility of progress. The refugee crisis of 2015, for example, generated tensions in the region, reigniting old wounds and unleashing a torrent of nationalism. The lack of a unified response in the Balkans to this phenomenon revealed the deep disconnection among the countries. While some governments chose to close their borders, others attempted to manage the arrival of thousands of people seeking safety. But what does it really mean to manage a humanitarian crisis in a territory where memories of war are still so vivid? Corruption, on the other hand, has become an endemic evil that devours hopes for development. Transparency and accountability are concepts that often seem distant in Balkan politics. Weak institutions and compromised judicial systems have allowed nepotism and clientelism to flourish, fueling discontent among the population. Frustration is palpable. Many young people see their future clouded by a system that appears to favor elites at the expense of the common good. Here, the question hangs in the air. How can the Balkans move toward a prosperous future if the roots of corruption cling to their soil? At the social level, the impact of past conflicts is felt in daily life. Distrust among ethnic communities persists, fueled by accounts of past injustices and an education system that often does not promote reconciliation. Younger generations, deprived of an educational framework that fosters coexistence, may fall into the trap of prejudice. Social polarization becomes a vicious cycle where history repeats itself and opportunities for dialogue fade away. Is it possible that historical memory becomes an insurmountable obstacle to peace? The immediate consequences of these challenges are evident. Economic stagnation, brain drain, and a growing sense of apathy toward politics. The youth, tired of empty promises, seek opportunities beyond borders, leaving their countries in an incessant search for talent and vitality. This exodus poses an even greater enigma. How can the Balkans build a future when their potential lies abroad? In light of this panorama, the enigma of the chapter becomes more unsettling. Can the Balkans break the cycle of hopelessness and build a future where peace and cooperation are possible? The answers are complex and multifaceted, woven into the history, politics, and culture of a region that has seen too much suffering. As we delve into the next stage of this narrative, we find ourselves at the intersection of memory and aspiration. The question persists: where are the Balkans headed in their quest for real and meaningful European integration, and what lessons from the past will guide their steps toward a future of peace? In a corner of the world that once burned in flames, the echoes of the Balkan Wars resonate with a weight that transcends time. As we approach the end of this journey, it is essential to reflect on the path toward a future of peace. A future that, although still shrouded in uncertainty, begins to emerge from the shadows of a turbulent past. The historical context preceding the quest for peace is a landscape marked by devastation, betrayal, and fragmentation. The wars that tore this region apart in the 1990s not only left visible scars on the land but also dug into the souls of its inhabitants, forming a narrative of suffering and resilience. The peace treaties that followed, such as the Dayton Agreement, offered a fragile hope, an attempt to restore order amid chaos. However, the foundations of that peace were, and often still are, unstable, supported by promises that sometimes seem as ethereal as the mists that cover the mountains of the Balkans. The key figures in this story are those who, amid the storm, made decisions that changed the course of nations. From political leaders like Slobodan Milosevic, whose nationalist ambitions influenced the outbreak of war, to ordinary men and women who fought to survive in a climate of hostility, their decisions, often driven by desperation and the hope for a better future, generated a domino effect that resonated across national borders. But was this the only dynamic, or were there larger forces at play, manipulating the threads of this human drama? Over the years, the events that followed the cessation of hostilities reveal a complex process of reconstruction and reconciliation. The nations of the former Yugoslavia, each carrying its own baggage of pain and resentment, embarked on a journey toward European integration. This path was not straightforward. It was fraught with challenges, from corruption to the resistance of those who still longed for the past. However, the European Union stood as a beacon, offering the promise of a shared future and the possibility of overcoming old rivalries. The question that remains is, can European integration truly erase the wounds of the past? Or will it simply be a coat of paint over a deeper problem? As nations strive to integrate into this new European framework, ethical and social dilemmas arise. Historical memory, often distorted by national narratives, raises questions about how the story of the wars should be told. Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past if we do not confront our truths? The new generations who grew up in the shadows of these conflicts are burdened with the weight of a complicated history. What legacy is left for them? How can they, who did not live through the war, understand the scars that still mark their parents and grandparents? The immediate consequences of these efforts for peace and reconciliation are palpable. As the countries of the Balkans move toward cohesion, significant changes are observed in politics, economics, and culture. However, the shadow of nationalism remains a latent threat. Elections often reveal a divide between those advocating for progress and those clamoring for a return to former glories. The echo of past violence often manifests in political rhetoric, creating a climate of distrust that can undo years of hard work. The enigma that persists on this journey toward a future of peace is ultimately the question of the nature of memory and forgiveness. Is it possible to build a future in which old wounds heal, or are they doomed to reopen with each new conflict? The answers are as varied as the voices of the inhabitants of the Balkans, each resonating with its own story and perspective. As we conclude this chapter, we are left with a reflection on the legacy of war and the yearning for peace. The Balkan Wars have imparted profound lessons about the fragility of peace and the strength of the human spirit. As nations move toward an uncertain future, it is crucial to remember that peace is not a destination but a journey filled with challenges, learning, and the hope for a better tomorrow. The future of the Balkans is uncertain, but history teaches us that even in the deepest shadows, the light of reconciliation can be found. The echo of ancient divisions can transform into a song of unity if nurtured with understanding, respect, and an unwavering commitment to peace. Are we willing to embrace that future? Only time, that mysterious and sometimes cruel teacher, will tell.